Okay, good morning, everybody. My name's Paula Byrne, and my partner here is Renee Mathey. Today, this is a session that we do called Leadership in Action, where every Thursday, just for 15 minutes, we talk about some leadership topics. And so the structure is one, we just open with a question, a kind of a reflective question for people to ponder about. Then two, we talk about, in relation to that topic, what are some of the challenges or misperceptions that people have? And then as leaders and managers, what are some of those common challenges that we see? And then we'll talk a little bit about some sort of tips that you can go through. Today's topic is, are you leading consciously or just reacting? So I'm going to ponder for a moment and ask that question to Renee. Renee, when we talk about leading consciously versus reacting, what comes to mind?
As leaders and managers, there's often the kind of just the hustle and bustle of, because you're not operating in a vacuum. You've got your team, you've got your leaders, and a lot of times, I'll speak for myself, I used to be in autopilot and just taking action based on what was coming at me versus having a choice and being intentional about how I structure my day or the conversations I'm having. And it always felt chaotic and just putting fires out more than really leading with intention. And so as I've developed myself and done some professional growth and leadership growth, realizing the difference in what it feels like when you're leading consciously versus just reacting. And you just have a lot less choice when you're reactive. And then you always feel like you're behind the eight ball, or at least I felt like I was always behind the eight ball.
Yeah, and I think that this has kind of been core to our own sort of mission. Our mission has been around raising the consciousness and competencies of leaders. So we want to talk about your leadership isn't just about what you do. It's also about kind of who you are and where your leadership is coming from. And so what we want to talk a little bit about, sort of how sometimes it's important to kind of slow down and sort of understand a little bit more about where your leadership is coming from, what we call sometimes the inner side of your leadership, and then the outer side of your leadership is how that gets manifested. And so things like self-awareness can shape, your decisions or your interactions. And some of the challenges that, and I think, Renee, you talked a little bit about, you were kind of operating autopilot, what other kind of challenges or misperceptions do sometimes leaders have?
Yeah, I think the most impactful thing that I learned was, with technology and AI and different trends, things happen really quickly, especially in technology. And yet our own human system is still wired for survival. And so I think what was most powerful for me was understanding cognitive biases, the way our mind is wired, and how that impacts how we engage with people, how we make decisions. And then the more I understood that side and brought awareness to what are my cognitive biases, what are the ways in which I can be reactive, what are the things that set me off in a certain trajectory. I think that level of awareness, because you have awareness around all kinds of things. But for me personally, understanding human behavior has definitely been the most impactful.
Yeah, and I think for me, like one of the things, and I was just reflecting on this, is that also recognizing that, sometimes when we sort of think everything is wrong around us, we have to kind of take a step back and look at ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
And so, and one of the questions, I often ask leaders when sort of in coaching session is, so what part are you playing in this?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's and that can be a little bit of a jarring question, because now I have to sort of think about, well, okay, am I fully self-aware of what is the part that I'm playing in this? And so some leaders don't recognize their own role in some of these challenges. And so I think one of those sort of first questions I love to ask is, okay, so, and I have to ask myself, what part am I playing in
Mhm.
this as well, you know?
Also, if anyone's watching, we'd love to hear, where you're leading from. If you want to put it in the comments,
Or the chat, yeah.
um, would love to hear just how you experience this. But I think, from what you were saying, Paul, the professional, when you start developing your leaders, when you start developing yourself, at this point, I've come from the perspective that it's fault's not the right word, but it's always turned back to me. How did I play a part in this? Because I have, even if it feels like it's the other person, or if you're thinking to yourself, you want to complain about the other person, the first question is, okay, how did I cause this? It's a cause and effect.
Or what can I control?
Yeah.
You know?
And how
Yeah,
can I change the situation or respond differently than my wired survival instinct wants to respond or react to.
yeah. Now we have like one of the things that is also like just being aware also can also be a challenge because many times we get feedback and people say, okay, and so you're aware, but sometimes you have to do something about it, not just be aware,
I went through
What?
a period where I was doing so much self-discovery and self-awareness, and it was like I was almost addicted to it, and I just kept digging deeper and peeling away the layers. And then I got to a point in a really challenging situation, and I'm like, I just don't want to be aware anymore, because you have that responsibility once you're aware of it to do something about it. And I just wanted to like blindly move through whatever challenge I was going through at the time. So
Yeah, and there's a framework that we use, which we call the 4 A's of conscious leadership. And there's sort of 4 steps. There's awareness, which is around kind of recognizing, patterns, biases, or leadership blind spots. And then the next thing is acknowledgement, which is around, am I acknowledging or accepting responsibility for those? Then there's the third A is action. What am I committed to do? And then the fourth is adaptation. So we're going to explore those a little bit more. And awareness is probably one of the ones we start with. And so we talked about sort of patterns, biases, and blind spots. Let's explore that a little bit more, Renee, in terms of what other things come into play in terms of awareness.
yeah, and I would love for the people watching live or on the replay to grab a pen and paper and write or respond to, what place are you leading from? Is it conscious leadership or more reactive? And then if you've done some development, which hopefully as a leader you have done some professional development, are there any blind spots that you've become aware of? And again, you can drop in the comments or just do it personally yourself, but just take a couple, like a minute or so to jot that down. And then I can share some about that. All right, Paul, do you want to rephrase your question to me again?
Yeah. So the question is like, when we think about awareness, we talk about patterns, biases, blind spots. What other things come into awareness that will help us if we're aware? Like what are the things that if we can identify for ourselves can help us in terms of how we lead?
Yeah, I would say for me, two things that really had an impact on leadership were two biases, actually. One was the halo effect. They'll say people buy from people they like, but that plays into the actions you take as a leader. And so that halo effect is oftentimes we can promote someone or let things go based on a person's personality versus their actual competency. And that happens too in reorgs and things like that. We always say leadership is relationship based. So there is some, you know, truth to that we're not going to avoid, but it has more to do with being aware that it's happening and when it's happening. And then the other one is, what is it called? The idea that you can have an outcome that turns out good or has great results. Then there's the assumption that the decision that you made, the outcome bias. So the decision that you made was a good one, so you can have good outcomes with bad decisions. So then that tapped into, okay, how am I making decisions? Is there a process that I have? Is it gut feel? Is it a combination of both? And so that taps into like, okay, I became aware of that. Now I have to acknowledge it. And then what's the action I have to take in order to, change the trajectory if that's what we want to do?
And two things, we won't have time to delve deep into these, but I think also think about what are the stories and fears and that sort of trigger and shape your leadership style. I mean, many of us have the story we're not good enough, which is kind of like the imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I sometimes even think, well, who wants to hear from me?
Oh, yeah.
But I've also recognized that sort of sharing some of our perspective can be also helpful for others. But like we all have stories that we tell ourselves that impact. So I'd sort of question people, what is the story that's you're telling yourself that's impacting you being your best? Mm-hmm. And I think, and then the other thing we talk about in awareness is strategic self-awareness, which is the you that I know me to be or the you that you know me to be. And understanding both of those perspectives can be—
and what the gap is.
Yeah, and what that gap is. So let's talk about the other sort of steps. Acknowledgement is really around taking ownership, because we can be aware, but we just don't take any ownership for it. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because what we talk about sometimes, you were unconsciously incompetent before you were self-aware, and now we're making you consciously incompetent. And that's a very sort of uncomfortable place. And that's where kind of the work needs to take place. And
Oh, sorry. It just made me think of our first Leadership in Action when we were talking about what conversation are we afraid to have, but we were really focused on another person. So, but this can apply to ourselves, right? Like, what conversation are you afraid to have with yourself, which taps into acknowledgement, because in order to acknowledge, there's some things that you have to face about yourself that you might not want to.
But also, you may want to engage in sort of self-compassion and let yourself off the hook sometimes, to allow you. And you're not alone. We kind of all go through these kind of journeys themselves. And I think once you recognize that you're not alone, and can kind of embrace that and realize that it may be a little uncomfortable, but that's where the growth comes from. So how about we talk about the sort of the next two steps? So, we have awareness, we have acknowledgement, and then the third one is kind of taking action. What are some of the tips you might have in taking action, Renee?
Tips on taking action: start small. Like you might have some really little micro insights as you do some of this reflection, but action leads to data. And I think that's the biggest thing, instead of thinking about like, oh, I failed as a leader, or whatever those stories you're telling yourself, which are typically, when I work with people, they're typically negative, and they think they've failed in some way. And just look at that feedback as data and information to help you take the next step. And so, new habits, new behaviors. I like to focus on, if this is the thing I became aware of that I don't really like about my leadership, then who do I need to be the leader that I want to be, and make sure it's aligned with how others see me. But my biggest tip around that is just small actions every day. You're doing them anyway. You're taking action every day on things. So as you build your self-awareness, you'll have more choice in which action to take.
Yeah, and then the last one we call is adaptation. Realize that this is a kind of a journey. It's not a straight line. And so sometimes it's around, you learn something about yourself, you take a little action, you then explore, well, what impact did that have? And then how do I adapt? And it's a continuous adaptation. So we have these 4 A's of conscious leadership: awareness, acknowledgement, action, and adaptation. So we're out of time, but I'd like you to reflect on what is one step that you can take going forward that you might help you lead more consciously. And so thank you.
To share, we always want to, whoops, sorry, Paul. I just want to tell you, we want to hear what you're thinking. So if you find something insightful, let us know.
Yeah. And so thank you once again for joining us this morning. And next week, we will have another Leadership in Action where we will talk about decision making. And we will send out and ponder a question around that. So thanks once again.